Hey everyone, welcome to another Turning the Tide video. Today I'm joined by Erich Hoyt, who's a whale and dolphin researcher. He's also a naturalist, author, conservationist. He's a research fellow with whale and dolphin conservation, and he's also co-chairing the IUCN's Marine Mammal Protection Areas Task Force. His work has been featured in the New York Times, New Scientist, and National Geographic. Hi Erich, how are you?
Hi, Cameron. Just doing fine here. Good to see you.
It's a pleasure to have you. So I'm just going to dive right into it. How old were you when you first got into marine science?
I was 22 and I was asked to be a sound man on a film expedition to try to be the first people to, record and film killer whales in the wild. And we had a sailboat around Vancouver Island, British Columbia, and just set out from Victoria, the capital city, heading north, not knowing what we would find, if we would find whales or not, and it was just right at the beginning of when we were starting to, when people were starting to learn about killer whales. So it was like getting in on the ground floor.
Coming from a perspective of film and sound, how did that affect your initial impressions of working with orcas?
Well, they're very acoustic creatures. So, I remember the first time I heard them, I had a hydrophone, which is an underwater microphone, and dropping it over the side. And suddenly these really loud sounds are just coming through, these calls. And you can hear that you could hear that they were talking to each other and they were, there was a lot going on. And so that really shaped, the acoustic part shaped my perceptions of them. I knew they were acoustic creatures, that's how they learn everything about their world. They have good vision as well, but they, operating in the really dark seas, and feeding at night as well as during the day, they need that sonar, that ability to use sound. And at the same time, as a filmmaker, we were trying to capture their images, to get footage, which was really difficult at the time because we were in a sailboat with no engine. Um, Maybe not such a good idea, but we were trying to be respectful of the whales. And we also, didn't know how to film them or anything, and it's a moving boat, it's bumpy and everything else. So, but, over time, we eventually got video. And I think the visual thing was very important because along with scientists that were working in that first summer that we were there, in British Columbia, we found that you could identify them as individuals. So we started giving names to different whales. There was Stubbs and Nicola, and Wavy was a big bull with a wavy dorsal fin. And they started to take on almost like personalities. And the scientist who was, we learned a great deal from in that first summer was just beginning to piece together how to identify them and realizing that if you had a sharp photograph of that top fin, that dorsal fin, you could identify all of them. So that was really, the visual plus the acoustic was such an important part of this whole study because once we started going back in subsequent summers, we realized that these were the same animals coming back year after year, that they were in the same families, traveling with the same mothers. And in fact, these were long term relationships, very long term relationships. So it was an eye opener for me, not being a scientist at the time and not having a background in whales or, well, people didn't have a background in whales back then, really, but not having a background even in animal behavior or anything like that, but really being able to have to learn along with the scientists.
You mentioned briefly the orcas' personalities and really being able to see that. What have you learned about their behavior and their intelligence?
Well, it's intelligence is a funny word. We use that word kind of loosely to describe our own species. Let's face it. And I think Howard Gardner, a Harvard scientist, some years ago, had a theory of multiple intelligence. That intelligence could be expressed in lots of different ways. There's musical intelligence. There's something that's more like what we think of as being, good at mathematics and engineering, and there are other people who can't do that at all, and yet they are very astute, very shrewd. Well, whales, of course, evolved without the opposable thumb. So they don't have all these things that we've created with our hands. Instead, they have huge brains. We know that, but we really don't know what they use them for. I think that, we know a few things. We know that it's tied up in social behavior and probably in acoustics, and we can see evidence of learning, and we can see evidence of their intelligence. I think any predator has to be intelligent. If you look at a lot of the predators on land as well as in the ocean, that requires a lot more than if you're just grazing, out in a field somewhere, because you've got to figure out how to get your next meal and do hunting and all that. In a way, we thought they were intelligent, but then we kind of stepped back and thought, well, yes, they're intelligent, but it's probably beyond us to really appreciate the kind of intelligence they have, except we can appreciate it on a basic level, but we can't really evaluate it. We're still learning. So, yeah, it gives you a lot of humility.
You touched on like the complexity of sound communication with orcas. Can you talk a bit about their languages? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that individual pods can have their own languages and they even have names for each other.
Well, we don't know if it's a language, but we know that they are dialects. So each pod has its own dialect. When a baby is born, we've recorded the sounds, and they're really, almost like a baby bird, just like little cheeps, not very much sound. And they learned that dialect largely from their mother. I think there is some sibling learning, but it's largely from the mother. And so that's how the dialect is passed down, through that matriline, the mother's line. And that's really useful, because we can, in the middle of the night, you can put a hydrophone down and you can tell which pod you're listening to. You don't have to even see them. And in fact, for a while, there were mounted hydrophones around northern Vancouver Island. And I remember they went into a friend's living room, the receivers, so that during the winter, when it was, blowing 80 miles an hour or 80 knots and snow and everything else, the whales had passed by, and he'd say, "Oh, that's Stubbs's pod," or "There's Hooker's pod going by." So, you could be sitting in his living room and hear these whales and know who they were. One interesting thing I might mention is that killer whales are able to biphonate, meaning they can issue two sounds at the same time, almost like on separate channels. And other animals are capable of this, some other animals, but not that many. But that is a tool that it appears that they use when there are a lot of other killer whales around, or they're spaced out over a huge area and they want to communicate with each other. They go on this louder channel with two different vocals going out at the same time. Whereas the monophonic channel, as it were, they might use just for local, like having a conversation with your mate or your mother. So that's something we've worked out through later work that I've done with Russian researchers in Kamchatka the last 20 years.
Yeah, you co-directed that study in Russia. It was the first study of orcas in Russia. What was unique about that in comparison to a place like Vancouver?
Well, it was exciting for us because we always had heard that there were orcas on the other side of the Pacific, and yet nobody had ever studied them. And it took quite a while, but in 1999 there was a threat of them being captured for aquariums in Japan and potentially China. And so, with a Russian researcher and a Japanese friend that I work with, we put together a proposal to try and launch a study there so we could at least find out about them and hopefully protect them. And we managed to do that and then build on that. Very little money and still very little money to be doing it, but we managed to get. We've had 20 years now of research. This actually, we were afraid in this COVID year that we weren't going to get out there, but it appears we will be able to. I won't be going, but the team will be out there. It's all Russian students and researchers now who have all graduated from Moscow State University and St. Petersburg State University. Very talented researchers, and there are a lot of similarities. Back to your question of why is it interesting in terms of the Vancouver Island killer whales? It turns out that they do have the fish-eating type killer whales and the marine mammal-eating ecotype of killer whales. So they're almost like, and it probably will be someday, two different species. The ones that just eat salmon and the ones that eat marine mammals, including, seals, sea lions, sometimes gray whales, humpback whales, even sharks, large flesh. And the same kind of separation of the two groups occurs in Russia. There's a third group in British Columbia called the offshores that feed on sleeper sharks and have very worn down teeth and are really evolved to feed on these sharks. And we haven't found anything like that, and nowhere else really in the world have we found something like that. There are others that feed on sharks, but no other groups of orcas that are exclusively on sharks. So that's been interesting. The most interesting thing is that we've photo ID'd, made individual identifications of more than 2,000 orcas in Kamchatka and along that Russian coast. And if you take the British Columbia and Washington State coast, you're only talking about, well, you have the southern community, with 75 or so individuals, and you've got the northern community with closer to 300. And so it's far fewer numbers of individuals. Now, those ones were captured by aquarium captors in the 60s, 1960s and 1970s for SeaWorld. That's the legacy of SeaWorld, partly that those populations are in decline. But even so, there were never nearly as many as there are in comparable areas on the other side of the Pacific. So it's great to be able to study a species and to be able to do comparisons between the two sides of the Pacific with the ecotypes that are so similar and yet not exposed to the same pollution levels, not having been captured at the same rates and all of that. So it's, we're continuing the study. And I think it's it's important for conservation. There are a lot of reasons that we need to be there and to be have local people, in this case Russians, going out and doing that work. That was really my dream, was to get, not to go in there, with a bunch of researchers from outside Russia, but to try and create a situation in Russia where you'd have science and conservation going on locally.
You talked a bit about how aquariums are capturing some of these orcas. What's your insight on that as a person who researches them in the wild?
Well, I was never opposed to orcas, killer whales in captivity, until I went out into the wild and saw what they were like in the wild. After the first summer I was out with killer whales, there was a capture of killer whales off southern Vancouver Island, one of the last captures before they outlawed it. And we went out there only a week after being in the field, and it was shocking. We saw several members of the southern community, the ones that are so endangered now, that are considered endangered under the Endangered Species Act, and they were bereft. The sounds were haunting. I put a hydrophone down. The sounds were, it was so totally different than what we'd experienced in the wild. And then of course you see them in the tank, in the cement tanks. It's just, it's a travesty of what what you do to the largest, most beautiful predator on the planet with a with highly developed social behavior, and they're put into a little concrete pool that is a tiny fraction of what their range would be on that day. So it was a non-starter for me after I saw that. I spent about 6 months doing a research project at one point for whale and dolphin conservation in the early 90s, traveling around to all these aquariums, and including SeaWorld, and talking to them, and just to see whether, well, maybe there was a scientific or educational aspect that redeemed the fact that you were keeping them there. And I think in the early years, when fishermen were still shooting at them a lot, and when people were really afraid of them, there was an educational aspect, but it really didn't last very long, because we what I say is we know too much about them to be keeping them captive. It's the same way with whaling. We know too much about whales to be putting harpoons into them. Maybe that was okay for an earlier era when we really didn't know, but now we know, and there's no excuse for it. And I think the public is beginning to realize that in many parts of the world. At the same time, in China and in Japan, it's really a different story, and especially in China, the aquariums are expanding with big shows, and have been capturing killer whales even in Russia. So it's, our work is still cut out for us in terms of trying to teach about what, the value of whales in the wild, and keeping them in the wild and protecting their habitat, which is actually my main work these days.
Yeah, your main work includes stuff like marine mammal protected areas. Do you think that there's an issue at the forefront that's addressing? Would it be whales in captivity, or would it be something like overfishing?
Well, I think what we, if I can take it back a little bit, when I was first getting involved in whales, which was a time when Greenpeace was being started as an organization on the streets of Vancouver, and I knew many of the people involved in that, and the Save the Whale movement was happening. And I think back then we thought, if we could stop the hunting, then we would have saved the whale. But after 10 summers with killer whales, when the place that we had been studying them, a place called Robson Bight, was threatened with becoming a logging port from Canada's largest logging company. And this was the place where the rubbing beaches were and where they fed and where they rested. And we, a group of us got together and tried to stop the logging and get a protected area. We started to realize you've got to save habitat. Habitat. This is, that kind of concept had been accepted for many decades on land for land animals. The parks in Africa and and all over the United States and Canada. Fantastic places for giving habitat to certain animals. But it had not been accepted in the ocean. I think there was this idea that whales were just out there swimming around, and how do you know what's important to them? You can't protect the whole ocean. But what we found out with this photo ID, the photo identification, was that the same whales were coming back to the same areas year after year. And this, photo ID also happened with humpback whales and with blue whales and with right whales, all the different species of whales and dolphins. And gradually we began to learn that there are important places for the habitat of each of these species and populations. And so that really, after my killer whale work, became my driving interest, is to try to promote the idea that there were important areas. So about 6 or 7 years ago, we started a task force within IUCN that would try to address the fact that we really didn't know very much about where these important areas were. And the reason these areas are important is because of the threats, of capture, of overfishing, of bycatch. I mean, the biggest killer of whales and dolphins is bycatch, meaning when you get caught in a net that's targeting tuna or something else and it happens to catch whales. And the sort of ballpark estimate is at least 300,000 whales and dolphins are killed every year through bycatch. It's probably a lot higher, but that was the last estimate some years ago. We really have focused on trying to identify these areas, going region by region around the world, and then try to get them protected as what we call marine protected areas. And we're still at the steep learning curve of, maybe I should go this way, steep learning curve of learning, trying to figure out, where whales are, where they go, what's important to them. So what we know now is just these coastlines around the continents and around islands, and we still have the 64% of the world on the high seas, the international waters, where we're starting to develop techniques, but that'll be the really exciting thing over the next 10 years, trying to figure out where they go in the open ocean, because that place, that area is being fished heavily now and being explored for oil and gas and everything else. So we need to do it.
That's a really interesting point, because I think a lot of the conversation around marine protected areas and sanctuaries focuses on fish stock populations, but you're not in that conversation also considering the bycatch effects that reducing fishing on those stocks has.
Yeah, well, it was entirely on fish stocks until quite recently, when we brought whales into the discussion, and other people have brought sharks into the discussion. Because people assumed you couldn't protect for them anyway. But the demonstrated effects of protecting parts of the ocean, highly protected areas without any fishing, are that it becomes an important source for, the fish mass will increase and it will spill over to the outside areas. And of course, that's important for whales and sharks too, because everything's feeding on, everything depends on everything else in the ocean. So we're obviously in favor of those kinds of marine protected areas too. But our job is trying to figure out, what are the areas important specifically for the 90 species of whales, dolphins, and porpoises.
You worked with biologist E.O. Wilson, who has talked about a half Earth, setting aside 50% of the planet for sanctuaries. What are your impressions on that?
Well, I love E.O. Wilson. I was so lucky to go to his class in the 80s, when he was still teaching, and to go with him to Costa Rica on an ant expedition, which was a great learning experience for me. But yes, I think he's a visionary. It was the first time I ever heard the word biodiversity was in his class, and he introduced it. He says, we've got a new concept now. We're putting together biology and diversity. Instead of calling it biological diversity, we'll call it biodiversity. So there was a lot of really exciting stuff there, and early on, he was calling for large protected areas and big percentages. And I think we have to go there. Several governments now, British government and a few others, as well as the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, have adopted 30% as the goal, protecting 30% of the ocean. Right now, we only have about 7%, and it depends how you measure it. In terms of highly protected areas, it's even less than that. So we need a lot more. And if we have, respected scientists like E.O. Wilson asking for 50%, that makes it much more likely we'll get 30 or 35. If we could get that, I think it would be amazing. But it's it's going to be a big, it's going to be a huge job because we depend on the ocean as humans for a lot of different things. I think the cost of protecting biodiversity looks pretty good against the benefits, but we still have to convince the powers that be that to do it, just like climate change and everything else, it's a big job.
You mentioned E.O. Wilson. You also worked with Michael Bigg, a pioneer of orca research. Who has inspired you and cultivated your interest in marine science?
Well, it's I think certainly when I was getting started, it was E.O. Wilson on so many fronts, and also in correspondence later on. And seeing that here was a true scientist that was also a great teacher and was also a conservationist. So he had the whole package, as it were. Actually, the year that I was at Harvard and MIT, I went to Stephen Jay Gould's class and E.O. Wilson's class back to back. They were both teaching that year, which was unbelievably lucky to be able to dip into both of them. And it was such a contrast. I loved both of them. Stephen Jay Gould was a geologist who came to evolutionary biology more from geology, whereas, of course, E.O. Wilson came from the ants. And Gould, who has written many books and was a brilliant essayist, would spin out an amazing tale, and he'd take you along for the ride. But you couldn't. You had to just ride on his coattails. That was all there was. If you got it, you got it. If you didn't get it, then you had to, ask somebody else. Or E.O. Wilson was such a patient teacher. He had this technique of just really looking at everybody, all the students, and seeing, are you thinking, are you getting this? And he would slow down, and he would adopt. I love this technique. He would adopt a parenthetical um, concept to describe something. And then when he went back to that concept, he'd have a little tag that would give you that incident. You know, it was very clever. You see it in pieces of writing, and you see it in his writing, but you don't see it in lectures so much, in university lectures. But anyway, he was very important to me, and I think, you know, since then there have been a number of people. I think my current collaborator for the last 10, 10 years more or more, an Italian scientist named Giuseppe Notarbartolo de Chiara, who actually started with manta rays and named a species of pygmy manta ray, but then you know, turned to cetaceans as well. And we worked together as co-chairs of this task force. And you know, the being able to be his collaborator, but also learn from him every day, in a way, is just such a treat and such a gift. The whole business of learning from other people, you know, having a mentor, if you can find one, is very important. But also finding, you know, getting what you can, you know, from other people, and also from books, and from, you know, writing it down and trying to solidify it. It's really, really important. You know, I have had periods in my life when I don't have anybody, you know, when I'm kind of out there and I'm just trying to finish what I'm doing and going along. But then, you know, going to conferences or workshops and that sort of thing, you know, you kind of, you start to go back into the fray, as it were, and you get lucky sometimes, and you find someone, and you have one of those experiences where you really start to learn a lot and try to see how somebody else has put all the pieces together, you know, to that really teaches you. So I've been incredibly lucky. Also, having come from, you know, partly a journalism background, you know, writing stories years ago, um, that's the kind of tool, being able to ask questions like you're doing right now. I'm sure you can see this. You know, the fact that you can go out there and ask anyone any question and learn from that. I mean, that's an incredible thing, you know, and you'll be able to carry that through your life now. You see, you're developing it earlier than I did, which is fantastic.
Thank you. And you've been something of an educator yourself. You've authored over 25 books and hundreds of magazine articles. What has that meant to you to be able to pass on what you know through those kinds of forums and share what you're learning?
Well, it's, yeah, no, it's a nice thing. I mean, I think I did a lot of the books so I could learn myself, which isn't such a bad way to start. And I always feel that um, in a lot of with a lot of things, I feel I don't know something, so I want to learn about it. Okay, I'll write a book about it. People assume if you write a book about something, and this is true in some cases, that you know a lot about it. That's why you're writing the book. But you know, there's the other side, which is in the process of writing the book, you really learn a lot, and you solidify it, and you send it out, and you get it criticized, and you know, and you refine it, and it eventually becomes something. And then, but I am thinking of the audience when I'm writing it, and I do like writing for all ages. You know, I've written some for as young as age 9 or 10, as well as mostly for adults, and also for popular audiences as well as for academic audiences. And it's fun, you know. I mean, I'd like to do more with films, and you know, I've done a couple of film treatments of of my books, which was thinking about things, you know, with a completely different hat, and that was fun too. It's it is gratifying to have the work out there. I'm just, you know, grateful when I get responses, people that really connect, with it. For me, it's a process of learning as well as every bit as much as trying to teach.
If there's one thing you can leave people in terms of conservation, what would it be?
I think, yeah, I think people just, well, it's such a big job now, and it's becoming bigger. I think the most disappointing thing of the last few years is the political systems in the various countries that are supposed to be leading on conservation. And I don't want to get into politics in a big way, but I am political. Absolutely, everybody has to be political, and I think that the one, perhaps the one good thing which I was thinking early on, and I see other people are thinking about with the COVID crisis, has been that in some countries that have moved very quickly, we've been able to make huge changes to, to cope with it. And I think that does give you some hope that climate change could be dealt with. I think that is our big challenge: climate change and extinction of species, which is really shooting ourselves in the foot, both feet. I think the message is to get involved and to get stuck in and try and figure out how to make the changes that we need to, to make the earth, to keep the earth wild at some level, and to, to protect it, really, to nurture it. I think that's so important. The last few months being in lockdown here in the UK, I run, I walk or run every day, and go down to the sea and go into the woods, and that is a really nurturing thing, and I think a lot of people have rediscovered that in a way that they hadn't before, and maybe again, I'm going back to hope. I am a hopeful person, so even though I'm distressed with the way things have gone, but I think we have to really look at what's going on and make a huge effort to make it better. It's really, it's up to us. If we don't do it, nobody's going to do it.
What gives you hope, and what have been some successes?
Well, I look at the situation with marine protected areas. If I just look in the field that I'm involved in, there were no, when I got started, there was one marine protected area that included whales, and it had just been created the year before with gray whales in Mexico, in the lagoons, a small area. And now there are probably 700 or 800 around the world. And some of those I've been directly involved in helping to make them happen. And now we're getting to the point where we have more than 150 identified important marine mammal areas around the world. Well, mostly in the southern hemisphere, a few in the northern hemisphere. We've done about a third of the ocean, and over the next 5 years, hope to do more. And some of those areas are now getting protected. We had an area in Mozambique. Recently, I was in Mozambique in November, and we were looking at dugong and Indian Ocean humpback dolphins, an area that was really important to them. It was a South African company that had the leases to develop the area where this core area where this last population of dugong in Africa is found, and last viable population, 300 individuals. And the important marine mammal area we created was publicized. Some journalists did stories on it after we made the designation. And a few weeks ago, we heard that the South African company has withdrawn and given the lease, the blocks back to the Mozambique government. So I mean that was amazing because I think they have shown signs of being a responsible company in the past. They've funded a lot of research in the areas where they're working, so they're trying to make an effort. And this was a really good result. So I mean, there are a lot of little things like that that do show some, that show some positive aspects that things are improving. And I think that's what we live for, just those things day by day. And we hope that we can multiply them and get more and more people involved in pushing this kind of effort across the ocean.
To wrap things up, what is next for you? What are you looking to do?
Well, I've got, we're trying to work on the northern hemisphere now for the important marine mammal areas. So we have another half of the ocean for the next few years. We have to get it funded, which is going to be a big job. And we've literally just started to put that together, that project together. And then I'm also working on books. I have another book on in my series on deep sea creatures coming out in the autumn. So I'll be talking about that. And I'm working on other books. I don't like to talk about the books I'm working on till they're out because I have a lot of ideas, and some of them don't work out. And then if you say what it is, people come back and they say, "Oh, how's that book doing?" Or they say, "Or you finished that book yet?" And oh, sorry, it didn't work out at all. So it's not a superstition, but I think it's a practical policy not to say too much. But I don't want to retire. I feel, there's too much interesting stuff going on. There's too much to learn still. We know nothing about deep sea creatures, and that's less well known than Mars or the moon, and when it's on our own planet. So I think there's a lot out there that's pretty interesting, and if we can just keep some of it alive, and healthy, that'll be everything that I want for the next few years.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks a lot, Cameron.